Warning, this podcast contains heavy spoilers for not just one movie, but entire franchises. We highly recommend going and watching these movies before listening to us as a companion piece that stitches all the timelines into one creepy, crime-ridden story. There will be no more spoiler warnings. We do not break character. After this, there is no turning back. You've been warned. Hit the music.
You are talking about the nonsensical ravings of a lunatic mind.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's
alive! It's alive! It's
Started with a joke.
No.
What does a hipster serial killer do?
No idea.
Has sex with the bodies before they're cool.
Well, if you're going to have sex with the body, you're better off to do it before it gets cold.
You are classy. All right, Dahmer, let's do this. Hello and welcome to It's Alive podcast. This is a true crime, paranormal, interstellar podcast breaking down unbelievable stories that sound like they were ripped straight from the pages of a Hollywood script. I am your host, the man of many names, the outlaw Harley Ray, the bruiser Bronson, Dr. H.R. Smokenstein THC, or you can just call me Josh for short. And with me as always is my very own scream queen, the perfect combination of beauty and brains, the gorgeous, the sexy Amy Rose. Amy, what's up? Are you ready for this?
Nearly.
Now, ordinarily we could do a big ass intro, but I might have overestimated myself with this script and wrote too much. But I think it's all really good and I don't want to cut any of it out, so I'm going to go first episode's going to be bumperish, huge fucking issue.
Okay.
And the story I was working on is about a little town in California that suffers from a violent curse, spanning over 25 years and spawning 12 killers over 6 separate massacres. It would be difficult for anyone who is a true crime horror fan to not have heard the case of Woodsboro and the Ghostface killers. This bizarre series of events has spread through generations, infecting 1 or 2 disillusioned teens every few years, with the results yielding a body count of 48 victims, most of those being teenagers.
So what was it, like a cult? You're still only allowed. It's me and you cult. Only 2 people.
Oh, it's Star Wars. The Sith, the rule of 2. 1 master, 1 apprentice. Until we get to the 3rd massacre, then there's 1 guy, and then later on there's fucking 3 of them.
3 foot 1.
Oh, there's a lot of these people here. But, yeah, okay. So what we're going to do today is we are going to focus on the 1st massacre.
Okay.
And then not next week, that's bullshit, because we're releasing the first couple of episodes together. So you can move on straight away after this, where we cover the 2nd massacre, and then the 3rd massacre. And there's a lot there. I was going to do all 6 of these fuckers all at once. And then I realized they're all copycat killings and very repetitive. So we are going to cover the 3 that kind of cover this whole conspiracy, mastermind plot.
Okay.
And then focus on all the others a little later over time. We'll throw them in here and there as we go about,
Okay.
I plan to cover the 4th massacre in a couple of months. And then when the whole New York thing settles down and we understand what went on there, we can cover the 5th and 6th massacre, because that's all connected and it links back around to this original story. So it's it all does swing back around. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So where will we start? Today our focus is on the OG killers, the original Ghostface, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. Our sources for the story are the books Wrongly Accused and The Woodsboro Murders by Gail Weathers and Out of Darkness by Sidney Prescott, along with excerpts from the journal of Stu Macher.
So Gail is she's the main source for all these stories, yeah? She's actually written the actual books on the Ghostface killings.
That she has. For each spree, there is an accompanying book written by Gail. She is actually taking a lot of shit for this over the years. Some people kind of blame her books for the ongoing attacks, with each release being adapted to film and eventually inspiring the next round of Ghostface attacks. Now, when it comes to Stu's input here, I use the word journal loosely because it's more like a scrapbook of death and thoughts, and what we use from the book are the little bits that made sense and were relevant to our story today. I used to have one of these copies, you know, the ones covered in upside down crosses and pentagrams with metal lyrics and pics of hot got girls pasted on the pages.
Yep. Had the same hot got girls and all.
Oh,
Joking.
right.
Hot got guys.
And on that note, let's get started.
Oh no! Do you know who I did have was your man from Him? What's his name?
Oh, Villi Vallo. Oh, I thought they were so fucking lame.
I love them. I still like them. They're guilty pleasure, but I wouldn't anymore.
The only thing that gave him a slight bit of credibility was I was one of these kind of fucking jackass kids that did stupid stuff and loved Macher. So since he liked them, I was like, maybe I'll like him, and I'd force myself to listen to him every now and again, but it'd be like, this is it's too soft for me.
No, he was like a Finnish Johnny Depp for me. Finnish?
Girl,
Finnish.
no.
Are they Finland?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are.
Nice.
So on that note. And so our story begins in Woodsboro, California in 1978, when Billy Loomis was born to parents Hank and Nancy. To the locals of Woodsboro, the Loomises were your typical upper middle class family, with Hank being the family's main breadwinner, as a pretty accomplished lawyer. In Hank's early days, he had built a pretty good reputation for himself working for Sunrise Studios in Hollywood, eventually becoming lead lawyer for the studio. It was from this experience and reputation built by Hank at the time that Hank was able to open his Woodsboro practice, and from that position he had done pretty well for himself, in turn allowing Nancy to stay home and focus on being the primary caregiver to their only child, Billy.
Lucky. Sounds like a good lawyer will come in handy for Billy later.
Well, from what we know of Billy's early childhood, it was pretty average and uneventful. There's no major stories or warning signs of what Billy would eventually become, and he is described as a good, well-mannered child who really didn't cause his parents any problems. He was a pretty normal kid in what looked to be a pretty normal American family. So no usual serial killer signs here, no Billy bedwetter in the Loomis household, no freak fires.
Do you have any pets though? Like, how did you treat them?
I don't know. So, I mean, we might as well explain what we're talking about here, and that's the McDonald Triad. The McDonald Triad posits that animal cruelty, fire setting and bedwetting in childhood is indicative of later aggressive and violent behaviour in adults, particularly homicidal behaviour and sexually predatory behaviour. However, other studies claim to have not found statistically significant links between the triad and violent offenders. Other studies have suggested that these behaviours are actually more linked to childhood experience of parental neglect, brutality or abuse. Some argue this in turn results in homicidal proneness, and the triad concept as a particular combination of behaviours linked to violence may not have any particular validity. It's been called more of an urban legend these days, and I think I'd agree with it. I mean, parental abuse in general to a child is going to fuck them up and going to send them on the wrong path. Like, I mean, you look at the likes of Richard Ramirez there and stuff like that. I mean, that guy was around his weird psycho uncle who was like, his uncle like shot his fucking wife in the face right in front of Richard. Like,
Jesus.
but he'd be telling them all about the war and, you know, all the women they raped and all the people they murdered and all the ways they did it. And
Disgusting.
and that was his, you know, his influence, his idol, the person he looked up to, like, you know, his father figure.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I would definitely agree with that. At some point in middle school, Billy met and befriended local horror nerd Stu Macher. Stu was also born in 1978 and grew up on 261 Turner Lane, Woodsboro, in a large farmhouse with his parents and older sister Leslie. Now I have to point out at this stage, we don't have a lot of information on Stu's early life, as his family have stayed pretty tight-lipped on the subject of Stu, turning down many highly lucrative interviews, movies, TVs and book deals over the years. Understandably, they want to try and forget about the massacre and live their life as best they can under the circumstances. They have since left Woodsboro and have tried to make themselves almost anonymous to the outside world. It's kind of this reason that I think we should just respect their wishes and not name them here. I mean, they've changed the name. There's no need for us to publicise it. You know, they're victims here too.
Yeah.
If you really care that much, you can Google it. But, I mean, don't be an asshole.
No. Even be.
What we do know about Stu is he was quirky, a little eccentric, loved attention, and had a dark sense of humour. And a massive love for horror movies. Or more specifically, slasher flicks. This description may make him sound like an obvious suspect for the cops when the eventual murders and investigation starts, but to be fair, Who doesn't know a kid from school fitting that exact description? Shit, if I'm to be honest, I was a little bit of that kid. Just, I had the awkward shyness in place that stopped me being so outwardly quirky towards people I didn't know.
So he was a class clown.
Exactly. Wait, does that make me like a sad clown wanting to entertain but being too shy to perform?
That's sad.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah.
Perfect description of my teenage years. From what old friends have said over the years, Billy and Stu first started running in the same circle around 1989-1990, just before their teenage years, bonding over a shared love of all things horror. Together, the two used to spend hours fantasizing about their perfect slasher movie death scenes and how they would play out, framing the conversations as movie ideas to the outside listener, but that we know would eventually be played out in real life, leaving 6 victims and starting a legacy of death that would continue to plague Woodsboro for years after. Again, to me, this is normal. I mean, we both hung out with similar groups. We would been a part of the metal community. Punks, scots, skaters, metalheads. Horror goes hand in hand with all these kids. My friend group was like a blend of all these subgenres, and this is the type of conversations we had while we watched slasher movies.
Yeah, my friend group was pretty much the same.
It's pretty safe to say that at this point, being bullied or being outcasts or victims in the schoolyard was not the motive for these school-going killers. They were, from what we can see, pretty well liked and popular guys. They had a pretty good circle of friends, and both guys even had girlfriends. In fact, Stu's third victim was a recent enough ex-girlfriend, and his current girlfriend at the time, Tatum Riley, would also fall victim to his and Billy's real-life horror movie massacre.
Yeah, this was a huge issue at the time, the whole Columbine effect.
Yeah, they went after everything at the time. Comics, video games, music. So obviously horror and slasher would be top of the list when it came to explaining the violence amongst seemingly average teens from the late 90s onwards. Introvert teens who enjoyed horror, metal, rap, games or comics were seen as public enemy number 1. Think like Muslims after 9/11. Serious profiling going on here. And I mean, you're talking about the Columbine effect. I mean, we might as well explain what the Columbine effect is. That was like the first really publicized major school shooting in America.
Yeah.
Like on April 20th, 1990, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold went to school one day and shot the place up.
Fuck.
Had a few bombs on them too, but they didn't go off. They left 10 victims in their wake, in their path?
In their path.
In
their
their
wake.
path. In their wake.
In their wake.
In their wake. Sounds more
Yeah.
like in their wake. And then the two of them killed themselves. Did you ever see the picture of that online?
Yeah.
The two of them just kind of 1 minute like walking around looking like they're fucking about, and the next minute they're like laid out on the floor.
Gone. Yeah.
Fucking psychopaths. At the time, there was a lot of like videotapes and diaries like we're talking about with Stu here. And it kind of would lead you to believe that they were bullied and that they listened to a lot of metal like Marilyn Manson and fucking playing Doom the video game and violent fucking movies and stuff like that. So it all got blamed at the time, and I mean like it changed a lot of plans for horror movies back then. I mean, horror movies got cheesy after that because they needed to downplay the violence in them because of all the censorship, you know?
Yeah.
Because of this Columbine effect, like you said.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, even when you look at, like, Stab Tree, and that movie was plagued because, I mean, first it got shut down because of the Third Massacre, which we will talk about in the next episodes. But also when they went back and decided to do it again,
Yeah.
it had to be completely switched around. I mean, originally in their idea here, Stu was going to survive in the Stab universe and was going to be leading a cult of Ghostfaces in Woodsboro from jail. But then they had to like, they couldn't use teams anymore because of these kids going and shooting the place up. So it had to be adults this time, and everything got switched around.
Yeah.
So, what could have been? Hey you, want to be the coolest horror nerd at the party? Then come check out our new line of merch at teespring.com. We got t-shirts, hoodies, hats and mugs with new products being added constantly. Support your favorite podcast by wearing the merch. Post your new gear on Instagram and tag us for 10% off your next purchase. That's www.teespring.com/It's Alive shop. Make your style alive today at teespring.com. Teespring.com is a third-party company. All issues, questions, and refunds should be directed to them. It's not our fault. Why are you screaming at me? It's my first day. Fucking quick, get your own fucking t-shirts. Back to the show. So while things were going well for Billy at school, his home life was a different story. You see, all was not well in the Loomis household, and it would have an effect on Billy that would ignite his thirst for blood and vengeance. At the time, it was a well-kept secret that Nancy suffered horribly from various different mental health issues. From what I've read, Nancy dealt with severe depression, anxiety, paranoia, and wild fits of rage almost daily. This meant Billy was often witness to Nancy violently attacking Hank, as she regularly flew off the handle. These fits of rage were known to be extremely violent, with various police reports for domestic disturbances at the Loomis address. To the best of our knowledge, though, Billy was never on the receiving end of this rage. In fact, quite the opposite. Nancy was nothing but gentle and caring towards Billy, constantly doting on her only child and son.
It's funny the way that works, isn't it? Like you've two kinds of killers, the ones that aren't tugged enough and then the ones that mom loved a little too much.
Definitely. And the over-loved stuff is something we will come across time and time again. Just wait until we cover Norman and Norma Bates, or Pamela and Jason Voorhees. Hell, just wait until like episode 2 and you'll see just how far Nancy was really willing to go for baby Billy. But for this story at least, Nancy eventually got the help she needed and was put on the medication to help ease her symptoms and improve her quality of life. But with Hank, the damage had been done, and over the painstaking months of Nancy trying different drugs and dosages, trying to find the right combination to get her balanced and right, Hank began to distance himself from the family, rarely being seen at home during this period, instead choosing to take business trips, or to work late and sleep on his couch in his office. The rare time he did stay at home, he almost always opted to sleep in the guest room, and at this point, just swapped pleasantries with his wife as they briefly passed each other in the halls.
That's sad.
Now, to be fair to Hank, the Loomises did eventually try marriage counselling, and for a while, things did start to get better. That's what made the next reveal a bigger slap in the face to Nancy. About 6 months into counselling, and with Hank back sleeping at home in the master bedroom with his wife, Nancy received a phone call. The anonymous man, which Nancy has once said to have described as cold, creepy, and impossible to place her age, told her that Hank had been sleeping with local woman Maureen Prescott, and that the affair had been going on for years behind her back. Now, I don't know what exactly was said on the phone that day, because I wasn't there, and all involved that were are now dead. But the strange man must have been convincing, because without confronting Hank, or without as much as thinking about Billy, Nancy packed her bags and bailed, while both the Loomis men were at work and school that day, leaving no note or indication of where she had gone or when, if ever, she would be back. Billy was devastated. His doting mother was gone, abandoning him and his father, leaving them in pieces. Billy was angry. Billy wanted answers. But most of all, Billy wanted revenge.
Kind of feel bad for Billy now, like he just missed his mom.
Yeah, I get that. You come home from school one day and the woman that treats you like royalty has up and abandoned you. It's understandable you feel a bit angry.
So what about the creepy phone call?
All will be revealed soon. You just gotta hang tough until episode 2.
Oh, cliffhanger.
Now, Woodsboro is a small town, and I think most of our listeners who have grown up in small towns could tell you that rumours travel fast around a place like that. So it didn't take long for Billy to get the answers he was looking for. And with Stu in his ear ramping up the fantasies, it wasn't going to be too long before tragedy would hit Woodsboro and would start a curse on the town that still runs to this day. Nice to know it's not just small towns in Ireland that can't mind their own business.
Yeah, he sneezed wrong in an Irish community and it'll be in the local announcements and mass that someday.
So as I said, it didn't take Billy too long to figure out what it was that caused his mother's sudden departure. And while yes, rumours spread through Woodsboro like wildfire, and pretty much everyone knew Nancy had left Hank due to his extramarital misdeeds, what they couldn't tell Billy was who he was cheating with.
Nice, juicy gossip and a mystery.
So one night, after a marathon sessions of their favourite killer flicks, Billy and Stu decided to start following Hank. Billy was determined to find the home-wrecking bitch that had driven his mother away, and when he found her, he planned to get rid of her, opening the door for Nancy to return and for his family to be put back together.
So that was Billy's motive, but what's Stu's excuse?
Stu's excuse was simple. He's a psychopath. And he just wanted to live out his horror fantasies. To be honest, I think people sleep on Stu a little bit. Like you said, Billy had a motive. Billy had a strained home life and was witness to his mother's violent outbursts, not to mention what he might have inherited from Nancy when it comes to the mental health.
Yeah.
Stu, on the other hand, had none of that. Stu grew up in a close, loving family. He was just a spoiled, entitled kid who wasn't spanked enough as a child. Or maybe even spanked a little bit too much, if you know what I mean. Going back to what we were talking about with the...
McDonald trial.
No,
No?
about the over-loving mothers and not loving enough mothers.
Yeah, but you spanked too much.
Yeah, well, Stu was just a psychopath, drawn to violence, your average everyday serial killer piece of shit. There's a chance that without Stu's influence, Billy may have, been helped with therapy and may have never gotten past the fantasy stage.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see later when we talk about the murders that Stu's attacks were often more violent and theatrical. He was looking for shock and awe. He wanted to be the big, scary killer from the movies. But instead, he was relegated to the stooge, the sidekick, Billy's little lapdog.
So it sounds like you think that Stu is the real catalyst for all like the Ghostface stuff.
I just think he might be overlooked. And maybe I'm giving too much credit to Stu. I mean, there's another version of these events that really downgrades Stu to just another patsy. And it's something we'll discuss in detail in part 2 and maybe part 3. I don't know yet, of this series. Right now, I'm just working with the information we had roughly around the time the first massacre happened.
Let me guess. For more on this, stick around for episode 2.
Double cliffhanger. And I don't want people to think I'm downplaying Billy's involvement here either. It's super possible this would have all played out the same way without Stu's involvement. I mean, Billy had some serious mommy issues and an all-around deep hatred for nearly all women. But the likelihood really is that Billy and Stu just formed the perfect storm together, and that storm was about to hit the people of Woodsboro hard.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of Billy, and I think this man, when he was born to kill, like, he proper sleazy and slimy looking. If you add in Stu, it's definitely not a 2 heads are better than one kind of situation. I can only imagine what 2 sick minds like that could together.
No need to imagine, because I'm going to tell you.
Nice.
Because this is where the hunt begins. The boys went to work planning their little stakeout, deciding to take it in shifts, tailing Hank until his bitten side revealed herself to them. It didn't take long for that to happen. That evening, as Billy and Stu sat in the Loomis basement discussing their plan again, they heard Hank call to tell Billy he was heading out for the night. And the guys, being the go-getters that they were known to be, sprang into action following Hank to a small motel just at the edge of town. There, Billy and Stu watched him get out of the car, walk to room 203, and knock on the door. It was then Billy saw the face of his first victim, and in his mind the source of his anger, hate, and pain. It was a face that he recognized instantly as Maureen Prescott, the mother of his girlfriend of 2 years, and one of the main sources for this story, Sidney Prescott.
Oh, the big reveal.
The first of many in this story. Sidney Prescott, at the time, was the only known child of Neil and Maureen Prescott. Sidney was your typical good girl next door type, the type you'd be happy to bring home to meet the parents. A near straight-A student, Sidney was rarely, if ever, in any real trouble, and as far as teenage girls go, she was relatively mature and level-headed for her age. Hooking up with Billy in her sophomore year in Woodsboro High in 1994, this too seemed to have a pretty good relationship, with Sidney being completely in the dark in terms of how far her boyfriend's horror fantasies really would go. With everything I've read, up until the first massacre began, the only real complaint Sidney had towards Billy was he could be a bit pushy when it came to sex. Or to be fair, the lack of sex that was going on in their relationship. You see, Sidney was a virgin when she met Billy, and for 99% of their relationship didn't feel quite ready to fully pop her cherry, much to Billy's frustration. Little did she know, though, it was her virginity that was keeping her alive for most of the first attacks. And we'll have a lot more on that a little later in the episode.
You hear that, girls? Stay pure. All you gotta do is keep your legs closed and think of Jesus, and serial killers will back the fuck off.
Or have loads of kids. In these stories, I've noticed the only parents that get killed are usually the killer's own parents. So, all the other parents are safe.
Yeah, score 1 for premarital sex.
Yup. Get back to our story. Billy and Stu sat in Stu's car in the motel car park for hours waiting for Hank to come out. Billy was seething and had nothing but revenge on his mind. The plan was simple. Wait for Hank to leave, then grab Maureen as she made her way to her car. From there, they could take her to a nearby wooded area and do what they felt needed to be done.
Sounds like a man with a plan. So how did it all play out?
Well, Once Hank left, the pair began to pump each other up, really getting the adrenaline pumping. These guys were ready to go, and if Maureen had come out there that night, then there's no doubt in my mind, they would have killed her there and then. And if that had happened, maybe they would have been caught, and this would have all have ended with one tragic death. But fortunately for Billy and Stu, Maureen had other plans that night. Much to the surprise and amusement of the two aspiring killers, Maureen wasn't ready to pack up and go home just yet. And about 40 minutes after Hank left, she had another male caller come to her room. This man's name was Cotton Weary. Yes, the Cotton Weary of TV talk show fame, 100% Cotton. This is the story that catapulted Cotton into fame in the late 90s and ultimately what would bring on his demise in the year 2000.
I was a bit young at the height of his fame, but I found links to 100% Cotton online in my early 20s and I was obsessed. It was only 2 seasons. When I first found it, I swear I missed like a week of college just laying around in bed binging on food and watching 100% Cotton. Proper juicy and wild.
I remember some of the episode taglines were brilliant, like, surprise, I'm a drag queen and I want to confront my pimp. Good stuff. Solid trash TV. Loved it in my teens, which leads us in nicely. You see, along with being psychopaths, Billy and Stu were also dumb teenagers. And the thought of old Maureen Prescott whoring around town with not one, but 2 men in one night, then going home to play perfect mother to sweet little Sydney tickled their funny bone. This moment of levity brought about a little clarity, causing Billy to abort the night's plans, instead opting to slow down and to plan the murder correctly. They wanted to kill Maureen, but they wanted to get away with it too. Using the new addition of Cotton as a pawn, Billy and Stu planned to murder Maureen and pin it on Cotton. They just had to work out how exactly to do that. Or at least they thought they did. What happened next was one of the best examples of beginner's luck I have ever heard of. Billy and Stu began to stalk Maureen the very next day and planned to be ready to attack within a month, with Billy making long, detailed plans and Stu's idea for the murder getting grander by the day. In fact, they discussed it so much that the excitement overtook them, and instead of waiting the month and following their grand plans, they instead jumped on the first opportunity they got, less than 1 week later.
Yeah, see, that's what happens when you get too excited. Like, things start to happen fast, things that might require a bit more time and consideration.
Ooh, message. The curse of the premature attack.
The premature attaculator.
Sounds like a dirty Terminator coming back to sexually frustrate you to death.
What a way to go.
So, on September 28th, 1995, as Billy and Stu watched the Prescott residence from Stu's car a few yards away, they saw Cotton Weary drunkenly make his way up the Prescott Drive into the waiting arms of Maureen. The budding killers were quick to surmise that if Cotton Weary was in the Prescott house, then it was safe to assume neither Neil or Sydney could be there. And unless Maureen was into risky quickies, chances were they were going to be gone the whole night. This was an opportunity Billy just couldn't pass up, and the decision was made. As soon as Cotton left Maureen alone in the house again, they would strike, and Maureen Prescott would die.
First in a long, long line of bodies, obviously.
Unfortunately. So around 11 p.m. that night, Cotton fell back out of the Prescott home and into the waiting cab. It was time for the Ghostface killers to claim their first victim. I called them that, but according to Stu's journal, they didn't buy the Father Death costume for about another 9 months, and to be honest, in this instance, it probably suited them better to approach Maureen as is. I mean, Maureen knew Billy as the polite and respectful boyfriend of her daughter Sydney, and she knew Stu from him dating Tatum Riley, Sid's BFF. At this point, she had no reason to fear or be suspicious of the pair.
Yeah, maybe she thought it was her lucky night. I mean, she did have Hank and Cotton on the same night. I'm not slut-shaming or anything, but just making an observation.
Look, we don't know exactly what Billy and Stu said to gain entry, but what we do know is once inside, they unleashed a nightmare on this poor woman that would make Freddy Krueger blush. Over the next few hours, they proceeded to rape, torture, disembowel and stab Maureen, leaving her, in the end, nothing more than a mess of blood and guts.
Yuck.
According to Sue's journal, they sat and ate cereal when it was all done, because killing is hungry work, and then they relaxed watching cartoons until the sun was about to come up. It was at this point they decided to clean themselves up and leave. So far, this was a crime of opportunity for the pair, and they hadn't really thought about how to tie in Cotton. But as they were about to leave, Billy spotted a man's jacket. He was almost sure it was the jacket Cotton had arrived in earlier, and he couldn't remember seeing it on him when he left. So Billy grabbed the jacket and pushed the sleeve into a pool of Maureen's blood. He then threw it over himself to hide his face as he left the house. It was here the killers hit another massive stroke of luck, because just as Billy turned the corner away from the house, Sydney was arriving home from Tatum's, and she caught a brief glimpse of Billy, or more specifically, a glimpse of Cotton's jacket.
Oh, it's all coming up Millhouse for these guys.
Really is. This whole crime couldn't have went any better for the two first-timers. Unfortunately for Sydney, being home early enough to spot the killer leaving also meant she was first to come onto the scene of her mother's brutal murder. And it wasn't long until the Prescott home on 34 Elm Street was crawling with cops and reporters.
Enter Gail Weathers.
Well, yeah, but she was one of many. This crime got a lot of national press, and to be fair to Gail, she's only stuck in the middle of all this because she is very, very good at her job, and because she wrote the best book on the subject. Gail is a solid investigative reporter. Don't let her more recent morning shows fool you. Gail is a good journalist. Once the investigation began, it didn't take long for Maureen's relationship with Cotton to come to the surface. A relationship Sydney was not ready to accept, and along with the forensic evidence showing Maureen had been raped before being killed, led Sydney to the conclusion that Cotton had to be responsible. This tunnel vision would see Billy and Stu stay free men for at least another year and lead to 5 more deaths in Woodsboro.
So Sydney's kind of jumping to conclusions here, like.
Well, she just found out her murdered mother lived a sexy double life. How would you react?
Yeah, innocent or not, I don't want Cotton to hang. Like, I suppose anything linking him would be enough for me to condemn him.
Yeah. So the detectives focused their investigation in on Cotton, and after a little digging discovered Cotton had been at the Prescott home the night of the crime, and that only a few hours before had been stumbling around a local bar bragging about how he was leaving to go bang his married girlfriend. From what I hear, this sort of behaviour was common for Cotton, who up until this point was seen as a bit of a drunk and a known con man. So it's safe to say that Cotton didn't have the best reputation and didn't have a lot of people fighting his corner when the police came knocking. And Cotton, if I'm being honest, he was his own worst enemy in the story. And sure enough, when the detectives went to question him, he was drunk as a skunk and wildly belligerent. Now, he blames this on the grieving process, and looking back with all the information we have now, it probably was. But at the time, he was suspect number 1, and refusing to cooperate with the cops was not helping that case. He eventually became so agitated during questioning that he got himself arrested, and warrants were issued for his home and car along with DNA swabs for Cotton himself. It was with these search warrants that they came across the damning evidence that would seal Cotton's fate. The blood-stained jacket that Billy had left in, a jacket that Sydney instantly identified as the jacket she saw on the killer on that fateful morning. At some stage, Billy or Stu must have planted it in his car, knowing the cops would come to investigate the lover first. With the DNA evidence and Sydney as a witness, Cotton was a dead man walking, and as much as he begged and pleaded his innocence, was condemned to die for his crimes on February 14, 1996. And so on Valentine's Day, for killing his lover, Cotton Weary took his place as an innocent man on death row.
So that jacket really was the crucial piece of evidence here.
Yeah, but Cotton's personality didn't help. Despite what you see on TV, Cotton is actually said to be extremely unlikable. And a lot of people have said he made himself the main suspect just by being himself. But yeah, the jacket was the straw that broke the camel's back. So, with Cotton's conviction, it was official. Billy and Stu had gotten away with murder. And it's quite possible that if they had been able to stop, then our story would end here. But just like an addict joneses for a fix, the murder of Maureen Prescott only served as a gateway killing to more mayhem, and as the months passed, Billy and Stu found themselves again discussing fantasies. Only problem is now, they had gotten away with it once, and instead of thanking their lucky stars, they just grew more confident, and decided to mark the anniversary of their first successful kill with a massacre unlike anything the small town had seen before.
So you're saying essentially the Pringles slogan applies here, like once you pop, you just can't stop.
The Pringles slogan fits many special scenarios. But yes, Billy and Stu popped open a can of murder and they just had some serious munchies.
Nice.
Yes. The way they saw it, Maureen was just the opening story to their movie, a plot point that would help drive the narrative forward. To be a real slasher flick, they would need multiple victims and a solid lead girl, or their final girl. The final girl is a trope in horror films, particularly slasher films. It refers to the last girl or woman alive to confront the killer, ostensibly the one left to tell the story. But in their movie, the final girl falls to the big bad killers, and they would write the final scene, again framing an innocent man for their crimes, allowing them the freedom to plan their sequel. For Billy, there was only one girl that would fit this role perfectly, and that was his long-suffering girlfriend, Sydney. Billy had thought that killing Maureen was going to quench his thirst for vengeance. But since Maureen's death, his anger had simply been inherited by a completely unaware Sydney. The way he saw it, the apple wouldn't fall far from the tree, and that if given enough time, Sydney would turn into a lying, cheating whore just like her mother.
Yeah, poor Maureen's name is getting dragged through the dirt here. Like, she had a high sex drive. That's not a crime.
No, but what about poor Neil?
Yeah, well, like she could have just told Neil what she was into and they could have done their thing together.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's definitely a modern solution that's becoming more accepted in society in 2023, but this is 1996. And that generation still lived their public life with strict Christian values.
And hardcore Christians are known for being relationship experts.
So the plan was as follows. They would wait for Neil Prescott's next business trip and they would kidnap him. They would then proceed to murder a slew of their fellow students before finally killing Sydney and Neil, framing it as a murder-suicide, with the motive being Neil, driven mad with grief, goes on a wild killing spree before killing his daughter and finally himself to mark the first anniversary of his wife's murder at the hands of Cotton Weary. Billy and Stu would of course be the only survivors, shaping the narrative in their favour and making themselves the final heroes in the Woodsboro murders.
They got away with it once and it sounds like it was the same plan again, just a bit grander.
So on Wednesday, the 25th of September 1996, a little after 10 p.m, Bill and Stewie were ready to shoot the opening scene for their scary movie. The victims for this scene would be the 17-year-old couple of Steve Orth and Casey Becker. Casey is the real target here. She's the ex-girlfriend of Stu Macher and super popular with her peers. Stu knew taking out Casey first would be enough to cause a huge stir around the town. And Billy knew Casey sat next to Sydney in a few classes and saw it as a way to kind of play mind games. For Billy, this all has to link and revolve around Sydney. And Stu was on board for all that, but he was more interested in killing and the impact it would have on the town as a whole as opposed to just Sydney.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, Stu doesn't really have the same revenge motivation that Billy has. Seems like Billy's plight and targets were just lucky convenience for Stu.
Yeah, I think Casey was a Stu target though. Dumping him put her right at the top of his shit list.
Typical butthurt, man.
Now, again, we don't know exactly how all this went down because, again, most of the people involved are long dead. What we do know, or what we can piece together, is all based off their witnessed crimes, survivor accounts, and evidence left at the scene of the crime. We know that just after 10 p.m, Casey received a phone call from her killer. We know from Sydney's accounts that Billy and Stu like to play with their victims first, telling them that if they played a horror trivia game and get the answers right, they would let the victim go free. But if they get the answers wrong, they die.
Shit.
The only thing is, usually the final question was something to set up their attack. Asking stuff like, where am I watching you from? Or, what room in the house am I calling from? This usually left the victim in shock, placing them in a temporary frozen state of terror, allowing the killer duo to pounce and attack their prey. From what we can tell from the crime scene, at some point during the phone call, Billy or Stu took Steve, who they had taken prisoner on his arrival to the Becker home, and gutted him on the poolside patio, presumably in full view of Casey. While one was outside killing Steve, the other was inside the house ready to get Casey. From the mess in the house, it's clear Casey put up quite a struggle, even breaking loose long enough to get away from her attacker, not realising just yet that a second was waiting for her outside. It was around this time that Casey's parents came home to find the front door open and the house filling up with smoke. Casey had been making popcorn when Billy and Stu attacked, and it caught fire just moments beforehand. While Mrs. Becker put out the small fire, Mr. Becker went to investigate. It was he who first came across Steve's disemboweled body on the patio. Sensing he and his wife were in danger, he instructed Mrs. Becker to ring the police and go find safety at the neighbour's house down the street. What Mrs. Becker heard when she picked up the phone was every parent's worst nightmare. Casey, still holding the cordless landline phone, was desperately trying to call out for her mother for help. And all Mrs. Becker could do was stand by and listen as Billy and Stu butchered her daughter only a few yards away from her.
That is heartbreaking.
Pretty rough, alright. And it gets worse. Because if that was the sound of a parent's worst nightmare, then what Mr. and Mrs. Becker saw next was truly a vision from hell. Upon realizing the severity of their situation, Mr. Becker ushered Mrs. Becker out to the car. But as soon as she stepped outside the door, all their worst suspicions were confirmed. And they found Casey hanging from a tree, her guts lying in a steaming pile by her feet, her face twisted and stuck in the look of absolute sheer terror.
Jesus, these deaths are so hardcore and heavy. Like, once these guys get into the killer mind frame, they turn into vicious animals. Like, even the posing of the body for maximum shock, just twisting the knife a little more when it comes to traumatizing Casey's poor parents.
Yeah, they really wanted to make a statement with Casey's murder, and it worked. That night put Woodsboro back on the front page and put law enforcement under some severe pressure. Hey, you! Yeah, you. You like the podcast? Want some more? Then head on over to our Patreon page, where for just €5 a month you get up to 12 extra shows in that month, along with piles of mini-sodes covering fun facts from the world of horror and true crime. Each week we drop multiple shows such as Real Monsters, where we look at the inspiration behind the movie Killers, or Behind the Mask, where we take a look at the influential people and happenings in the world of Hollywood. All this, plus movie reviews, watch-alongs, and regular AMAs. That means Ask Me Anything. You really do get a bang for your buck. And by bang, I mean like podcast. I'm not soliciting or anything. Shit. Moving on. For just €5 a month, all this could be yours. So head on over to www.patreon.com/IAApod. That's www.patreon.com/IAApod. And start listening now. Before the death of Maureen Prescott, Woodsboro had been voted one of the safest places in America to live. Crime was petty and the violence was usually down to too much alcohol and could easily be solved with a night in the drunk tank. So it's safe to say that the brutality and the frequency of the murders over the last 12 months was a lot for the Woodsboro Sheriff Department to deal with. And while Woodsboro has a top-notch policing unit now, back in 1996 it was a much smaller and more local operation that didn't have a whole lot of funding from the government. The Cotton case fell into their laps and in their eyes practically solved itself in what was viewed as an open and shut case. But now, with the death of 2 teens on their hands and the brutality in which they were murdered, the Woodsboro Sheriff's Department had to up their game and had to work quickly to solve the case before any more bodies dropped in their small, quiet town. It was for that reason that on September 26th, the day after Casey and Steve's murders, the Woodsboro Sheriff's Department took over the high school with the plan to question everyone in the school with any link to the victims at all. Classmates, teachers, staff and custodians alike. Sheriff Burke was determined to leave that school with a lead or a suspect that day, but unfortunately had no luck.
But what about Billy and Stu? Like, were they interviewed?
When I say all classmates were questioned, I mean all classmates, and that included Billy and Stu, each using the other as an alibi for earlier in the night and visiting their respective girlfriends later on and fudging the time a little to make it seem like they couldn't have been in 2 places at once. A gimmick they liked to lean on while people were still thinking the crimes were that of one man. This seemed to satisfy the sheriff, and with a school of students and staff left to question, was happy to dismiss the pair and move on to his next interview.
Oh, so close.
Maybe an opposite day.
Alright. I guess they could have maybe taken a little more time to grill him, like maybe a little good cop, bad cop. Like, I've read a tiny bit about Deputy Dewey and I reckon he'd pull off bad cop, no problem.
We've obviously been reading different books. The name Barney Fife appears in most of the descriptions I've read of him.
Are you saying this man is not a genuine hero? Like, hasn't he been involved and stabbed in nearly all of these cases and still always helps bring down the big bad killers? Or at least that's what happens in the movies.
You can be a nice, albeit clumsy guy and still be a hero, and we'll definitely talk about his contribution to Ghostface's downfall a little later in the story. So, as Sheriff Burke and Deputy Dwight Dewey Riley interviewed the school, a media circus descended on Woodsboro like a plague of hungry locusts, starved for a scoop and ready to do anything to get it. None more prepared than the woman whose books make up the main sources for our story today. That woman was none other than the celebrity crime reporter Gail Weathers. Much like Cotton, this story is what pushed Gail from simple reporter to celebrity, and to her credit, her first book, Wrongly Accused, was the first bit of media to question the events surrounding Maureen's death. Gail was convinced of Cotton's innocence and planned to make her career off his case. So as soon as she got wind of another murder so close to Maureen's anniversary, she started to hypothesize that possibly this could be the same killer, finally proving that Cotton was innocent and boosting her book sale and follow-up book sales in the process.
I was watching some of Gail's old news reports on scene at Woodsboro, and I have to say, she is one brave woman.
Definitely.
I mean, have you seen those suits she used to wear? Like, that style takes balls.
Lime green suit is definitely a power move by Gail. 90s girl power at its best. I wonder was she a Spice Girls fan?
Yeah, in her dressing room blasting, "If you want to be my lover." You're getting pumped up for her show.
With Neil out of town and her mother's anniversary looming, Sydney made arrangements to stay at Tatum's house that night, not wanting to be alone in the house in the dark with all that was happening. Tatum had been set to collect Sydney at 7:30 that evening, but practice went long and she was running a little late. It was as Sydney sat waiting for Tatum that she received her first call from the killers. Billy and Stu were using an electronic voice disguising box, making them impossible to recognise, and for the next 10 minutes or so went back and forth trying to intimidate and scare a brave and defiant Sydney. It is believed that this attack on Sydney was played out by Billy, and at that stage he was not quite ready to kill his final girl. There were more victims in line ahead of her, but the movie needs tension and good scares, so that's what he set out to do. He was hell-bent on terrorising Sydney before he finished her off, and even though Sydney didn't know it at the time, she was safe from death, for that night at least.
But why take the risk?
At this point, you may be asking, why would Billy attack Sydney and leave her alive to tell the tale? Surely no, he was rumbled, and it was only a matter of time before the sheriffs would be knocking down his door. But you forget, this is a real-life slasher movie. And what's a slasher flick really without a scary, masked killer? The moniker Ghostface killers had to come from somewhere, and it came from a cheap drugstore Halloween costume Billy and Stu used to hide their identity and to instill fear in their victims. The father of that costume was nicknamed Ghostface due to its pure white colouring and its resemblance to the Edvard Munch painting The Scream. To be fair, for a cheap Halloween costume, the mask is pretty frightening, and I can imagine it filled the role it was intended for.
Why is it that the masked killers always seem the most invincible? Like, mask on, you're terrified. Mask off, and you'll probably fancy your chances against those nerd little shits.
I know, right? So, terrorising Sydney, Billy chased her around the house, teasing her with his knife, like a cat playing with a mouse before finally swatting it with his paw to devour it whole. With the doors locked and Ghostface Billy blocking her way, Sydney was left with only one choice: to head up the stairs, essentially trapping her deeper into the house with a crazed killer on her trail. But Sydney did manage to find a little sanctuary up there. She barricaded herself into her bedroom and made contact with police, noticing almost instantly that she was once again alone in the house, and that the prospect of law enforcement had scared her would-be killer away. You'd think with an attack like that and the cops on the way, Billy would want to get as far away from the scene as possible, but the temptation of seeing the terror he caused Sydney and the joy of watching the clueless cops struggle with no solid lead was too much for Billy. He quickly abandoned his costume and made his way to Sydney's bedroom window, ready as ever to play the role of the concerned boyfriend.
Idiot.
But Billy was cutting it close this time, and his cockiness put him in a situation that could have put all his plans to an end prematurely. As soon as law enforcement arrived, the abandoned costume was found, and along with a cell phone found in Billy's possession and his close proximity to the crime scene, Billy became a suspect and was taken in by the sheriff for extra questioning.
So at that stage in the 90s, we were just getting used to, like, cordless landline phones and call cards and beepers if you were, a drug dealer or a doctor. But mobile phones were only seen in American movies about super rich people, so it was super rare for anyone to have one back then. So that was super suspicious.
Definitely. For a teenager to have one at that stage, no way. I mean, I was like 13 when I got my first phone, but that was like 10 years after this event.
Yeah. I was like 11.
I mean, the only time you saw cell phones were, like you said, like super rich businessmen in movies like Tom Cruise and that, what's that movie he's in? The
Mission Impossible.
Show Me the Money movie.
Jerry Maguire? No.
I don't know. I don't like Tom Cruise. I don't watch his shitty movies. Fuck you, Tom. Nah. At the station, Sheriff Burke questioned Billy along with Hank Loomis on his whereabouts that night, and again on the night of Casey and Steve's death. Billy fed them the story of being with Stu earlier and Sydney that evening, and that he just called to Sydney that night knowing she was alone and wanting to check in on her, swearing he was innocent, claiming his phone records would clear his name. So the decision was made to hold Billy overnight until the records could be retrieved the following morning.
Surely this is it. I mean, like, what are the chances he had more than one phone? Or even today in a world run by phones, generally people only have one. Like 2 if you're a business person, but like his records have to come back dirty.
Let's see. The records came back clean.
No way.
Billy's personal number was not the number used to call Sydney or Casey, even though we know Billy was the one on the other end of the line most of the time.
But like, how is that possible?
We'll have to read on and find out. There was also Stu's attempt to get Billy in the clear, again playing on the Ghostface killer can't be in 2 places at once. Ghostface Stu rang Sydney again that night, teasing her for fingering Billy when obviously the real killer was still free and ready to slash again soon. This destroyed Sydney, who on one hand hated the idea of her loving boyfriend being a psychopath, but on the other was relieved that it might already be over, with Billy locked away under the watchful eyes of the Woodsboro law enforcement. The killing could stop and she would be safe. But that's not how it played out. And the next morning, Billy was back on the streets, ready to move his killing spree into the next gear. Dude was going into berserker mode. And within the next 18 hours, more bodies would fall. But what Billy didn't know then was he would also be in that pile of dead bodies, ending his part in, but really just kicking off the beginning of the Ghostface saga.
So what's the story with the phone here? Like, we know Billy made that call that night. Like, why else would he have had a cell phone in 1996? All right, how did the records come back clean?
Alright, the records came back clean because while a cell phone was registered to Billy Loomis, the number it had cloned to was registered to Neil Prescott. This led Sheriff Burke to look a little deeper into Neil, discovering that he never checked into his hotel and hadn't been seen or heard from since leaving for his business trip. With all this new information pointing the finger squarely at Neil Prescott and the anniversary of his wife's murder only hours away, it felt like the investigators had their man. Now their only problem was finding him before he could kill again.
Yeah, I feel bad for the cops here. Like, they were clearly way out of their depth. And to be fair to Billy and Stu, as dumb as they both are, they had a clever plan and they came damn close to fooling everyone. So it's kind of hard to blame the cops for getting stuck down the rabbit hole of Neil Prescott.
Yeah, I know. He would have been one of my top suspects. Him and Billy. I would have arrested him and grilled both of them and that would have just solved the problem. I'll tell you one thing. This group of students have to be the most dedicated scholars to ever grace a high school class. Because even with all that happened the night before, Billy and Sydney still turned up for school the next day. I don't know how you do it in America, but over here in Ireland, that would be an excuse to take like a month off of everything.
Try months. You could milk the PTSD most of the year.
Seasonal PTSD that magically eases from June to September. It didn't take long for Billy and Sydney to cross paths that morning. A meeting Sydney knew was inevitable, and a meeting where she would have to swallow her pride and admit she had been wrong. But even then, Sydney says she could feel an uneasiness inside her. Her body was instinctively trying to warn her. But after being stung once with the embarrassment of wrongly accusing her boyfriend and questions being asked in regard to Cotton's guilt, she decided to ignore it and put it down to bad nerves because of the ongoing situation. Those nerves would be tested again minutes later when another Ghostface would launch a brief attack on her in a school bathroom. Now, Sydney herself has said that this attack could have been another student playing a prank. Again, this costume was widely available and cheap. So since the original murder started, every asshole teen in town had purchased a Father Death costume, littering the school halls in cosplay killers just trying to get a laugh out of a very dire situation. The truth is, we just don't know for sure. But what we do know is that Stu was stalking the halls around the same time, and less than an hour later, he would take his next victim.
If he was around stalking a victim, then chances are it was him. Like, as shitty as it is to dress up in the costume, it's a bit of a stretch to then attack the main victim in the story.
Yeah, considering he was on his way to kill and was in a bathroom stall, do you think she interrupted him getting changed into the costume and he just saw an opportunity to cause some mayhem?
Well, a Looney Tune like Stu wasn't going to be able to help himself in that situation.
Because of the severity of the situation and with no real end in sight, the school was forced to cancel classes and a curfew was placed in the town. Again, due to a lack of living witnesses, we don't know exactly how it all played out. But at some stage before classes cut out, Stu lived out every angry schoolboy's dream and stabbed his principal to death. And just like Casey, he hung Principal Arthur Himbry from the football field goalposts, guts hanging out like a calling card for the whole student body to bear witness to.
Holy shit, this guy's like a Ghostface ninja. How is he getting away with these elaborate displays?
Luck. That's it. Just luck. Okay, it's honesty time. We have a confession to make. We suck at socials, no good at Insta, can't send a tweet or an X or whatever that supervillain looking motherfucker is calling it now. Stick to your space cars, Elon. But we know you want to chat, you want to be kept updated, you want to be alive all the goddamn time. So we're getting down from the antisocial soapbox and giving this a try. So come chat to us on Insta and Twitter at AliveAlivePod or hit us up by email at itsalivaalivepod@gmail.com. We want to hear from you. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. This is a project. It's still a work in progress and we just want to give you more what you like and less of what you can't stand. So give us a like, give us a follow. We'll always hit you back and we'll always try to reply to everyone. So come say hi. We don't bite. Well, at least Amy doesn't. And she keeps me well fed, so you got nothing to worry about. Now, back to the show. Seems like Stu was in the mood to celebrate because after the murder of Principal Himbry, Stu spread word around that he was holding a curfew party at his place. His parents were out of town and school was out. The perfect setup for a major rager. Or was it the perfect setting for the final scenes of his movie? It seems the reels were about to run out, and it was time for the killers to reveal themselves and put the end of their plan into action. And that's exactly what would happen next.
Ooh, exciting. We're in the end game.
And so it was set. Party at Stu's house, a chance for all 5 friends to have fun and unwind, to forget about the violence plaguing them and their peers for just a few hours.
Did you say 5 friends? So that's Billy, Stu, Sydney, Tatum. So who am I leaving out?
Oh, you're leaving out possibly the best character in this story. And possibly a bigger horror nerd than Billy and Stu combined. The right kind of horror nerd. The type who respects the gore but understands the story is just that. A story. Designed to entertain. That man is the highly strung but fun-loving nerd, Randy Meeks. Randy was a close friend of Sydney's from a young age, and through her relationship with Billy, ended up as the 5th wheel in the group. Although he hoped to eventually switch roles with Billy. He had a huge crush on Sydney. Randy worked in the local video store, a job he had been fired and rehired from at least twice. And it was here witnesses remember seeing Billy confront Randy on the day of the massacres. See, Randy, using slasher movie logic, surmised that Mr. Prescott was only a red herring. He was too obvious and just a prop to distract the audience, allowing the true killers to move freely away from police suspicion. He came to the conclusion that the only person that could be under the mask was Billy, the jealous, sex-starved boyfriend. Only problem is, he was telling all this to Stu. And when Billy found out, he decided he needed to put a stop to it. Randy himself said later that the fear he felt that day as Billy and Stu menacingly taunted him in front of the staff and customers in the store should have made it obvious that they were the ones behind everything. But they were all friends. They always fucked around like this, and by the time the confrontation was over, that's just what it seemed like. 3 guy friends busting each other's balls. But I think at that stage, Randy was left with an uneasiness similar to that of Sydney earlier, after Billy got cleared by the police. It couldn't really be them, could it?
There's red flags everywhere around those 2 guys.
No one suspected Stu at all. In fact, the only one to suggest he could be the killer was Billy himself when they were slagging in front of people and Billy had been cleared by police. Even if he did scream psycho with everything he did, he was still seen to have been proven innocent to the Woodsboro locals. The reason I say Randy is one of the best characters we have in this story is simple. We have so much footage from the night of the murders and nearly all of it stars Randy, so it feels like we know him. When I say we have a lot of footage, I mean we have a lot of footage. In fact, 90% of the party is on tape. You see, when Deputy Dewey Riley heard about the party from his little sister Tatum, he decided he would go along and sit outside in his police car to deter any would-be killer and keep an eye out for Neil Prescott, thinking that if he was the true killer, then he might follow his daughter and her friends to this party. And fair play to Deputy Dewey, as far as cops go, he sounds like he was a pretty cool guy. He could have just come up, sirens blasting, sending all the kids back home. I mean, a curfew was in effect. But Dewey, not wanting to be a party pooper, decided to just stay on surveillance. Thing is though, Dewey had struck up a bit of a friendship with Gail Weathers. And Gail, seeing Dewey as a lovable but soft touch, decided to stay close to Dewey, giving her a straight line to the police investigation and first dibs on breaking news and information. So it wasn't long after Dewey dropped the girls to the party that Gail's news van pulled up to the Macher home. And it didn't take long after that for her to find a reason to get into the house for a snoop around. Using Dewey and her TV celebrity status, she made her way into the party, and while the starstruck teens watched her in awe, slipped a small spy camera into the living room, giving us full view and audio and showing us all just how the evening really played out.
Can we use any of that footage here?
Maybe. I mean, you gotta remember this is the 90s VHS video quality. The sound doesn't translate over very well, and being a podcast, that's kind of important.
Yeah.
From here on out, there was really only one more incident that we have no witness to, and that's the murder of Tatum Riley. At some stage over the evening, Tatum went to the garage to get a beer from an old fridge and just didn't come back. Her body was later found by Sydney and then again by Randy, electrocuted and with her skull crushed hanging from a cat flap in the open garage door. Investigators eventually came to the conclusion that in an attempt to flee from Ghostface Billy, she tried to escape through the flap, getting stuck in the process. And Billy, being more about the scare than he was about the blood and guts, decided to take the easy option, simply opening the garage door, killing Tatum without even getting his hands dirty. We know this one was Billy because Stu was inside playing host at the party at the time.
Poor Tatum.
Yeah. Tatum's death was just the beginning of the horror that would run wild through the Macher house that night, and it wasn't long before Billy and Stu's endgame would be put in full swing. Next step was to lead Deputy Dewey to Neil's car, which they had dumped in a nearby wooded area just before calling in a tip to the sheriff's department. They would then have to get their final girl alone so they could direct the final scene in their sick movie fantasy.
They really had all the little details in place. I'm thinking to plant Neil's car in the woods by the house, even being confident enough in their timing to get the job done before the police showed up. Like, that all took serious planning and perfect execution.
Nice choice of words. Not long after killing Tatum, Billy arrived late at the party. At this point, news came in that Principal Himbry's body had been found, clearing the curious students out of the Macher home and back to Woodsboro High in hopes of catching a glimpse of their principal's mutilated corpse. The only people left behind were Billy, Stu, Randy, Sydney, Gail, Dewey, and Gail's cameraman, Kenny.
Sounds like we're nearing the final act.
Gail and Dewey finding the car meant it was time for their plan to get moving. But first, Billy had one more itch he needed to scratch. The perfect little detail to truly solidify their slasher team and to confirm that if you break the rules in horror movies, then the repercussions would almost always be your death. Billy was going to try once more to romance Sydney. One more shot before he finished her. So under the guise of talking about their relationship, Billy and Sydney went to the master bedroom of the Macher home and discussed their recent issues. It was here Sydney said the constant gaslighting from Billy had finally got to her, and convinced she was being frigid and cold towards him, she decided to finally give Billy what he wanted, and in doing so sealed her fate in the eyes of the killer.
I already told you, follow Jesus. He's the true saviour from Ghostface. Close your legs and open a book, girls. A good book.
Sarcasm?
Fucking right. Fuck those incel arseholes.
You see, most horror or slasher movies are made up of a few basic rules. The three most important being, you may not survive the movie if you have sex, you may not survive the movie if you drink or do drugs, you may not survive the movie if you say, I'll be right back, hello, or who's there?
So basically, don't have fun.
Pretty much.
I mean, I love a good hello, who's there, I'll be right back.
A bad girl at heart. Leaving Randy alone watching movies downstairs, Billy and Stu moved on with their plan. Waiting until Billy had finished knocking boots with Sydney, Ghostface Stu entered the room, attacking the couple and stabbing Billy multiple times right in front of the terrified and shocked Sydney.
Wait, what?
It's all bullshit. A phony decoy to put Sydney off the scent. Clever positioning and corn syrup. Really putting their movie knowledge into practice.
So Sydney thought she was watching Billy get stabbed, but really he was unharmed.
Not a scratch. Leaving Billy for dead, and in an attempt to save herself, Sydney took off, leading Ghostface Stu on a chase scene worthy of its place in any scary movie. Running through almost every room on the first floor of the house, Sydney found herself once again stuck with no other option but to go up. And with Ghostface Stu hot on her heels, Sydney climbed through an attic window to the roof. It was here, while trying to fight off Stu, Sydney lost her footing, falling from the roof only to be saved by Mr. Macher's fishing boat parked in the driveway below her. It was at this point that Sydney looked up to find the body of her best friend hanging lifeless from the garage door. Randy, hearing all the noise from this, would find Tatum directly after, just missing Sydney as she ran to find safety.
So that's a lot to process. Like, you justify death falling from the roof. Blind luck that the boat is where it is. You look up and there's your best friend hanging in the air with her head crushed. Like, that's a fucking nightmare.
Yeah. Sydney, snapping back to reality and realising she still had to get herself to safety, spotted Gail's news van. It was here she found cameraman Kenny, who had been watching the stream from the spy camera in the house. You see, the thing about this camera was it had a short delay and it lagged by 30 seconds or so. I mean, this was 1996, so this tech was still pretty good for its time. Sydney and Kenny watched in horror as Ghostface Stu stalked an unaware Randy, stopping just short of killing him as he had heard Sydney call for help outside and decided to go deal with the more pressing matter first. Again, I remind you, 30-second delay. This meant that by the time they realised that Stu was on his way, he was already there. And for supposedly the second time that night, he killed a man right in front of Sydney, slicing Kenny Brown from ear to ear and letting him bleed out right there on the ground.
Oh my God, they killed Kenny.
You bastards. In the midst of all this chaos, Dewey and Gail returned to the house, looking for Neil Prescott. Dewey went inside to investigate while Gail ran to the news van to call the sheriff for help and report the finding of Neil's car. It was here she found the lifeless body of her cameraman. Panicked, she climbed into the van in search of the phone. She was then startled by Randy, who she repeatedly hit with her phone. And at this point, Gail had had enough. She started the van and took off to get help, only to suddenly be met with a terrified Sydney standing lost in the middle of the road. This caused Gail to swerve off the road into a tree. Stu claimed later that night he had went to finish her off after, but she looked dead to him, so he decided not to waste time with the possibility of cops showing up soon.
The fact that you point out that Stu didn't bother going to finish her off tells me this comes back to bite him in the ass in the future.
Sure does.
Oh, awesome. Good.
See, after seeing Gail crash, Sydney ran back towards the house, screaming to Dewey for help. Help he wouldn't be able to give. Because when Sydney reached the house, she found Dewey stumbling from the front door, a knife buried deep into his back.
Oh no, not Dewey.
Sydney was lost. She had nowhere left to turn and didn't know who she could trust. As she stood there, most definitely in a deep state of shock, Randy and Stu, now out of costume, came back on the scene, both screaming accusations at the other.
How could she know? Like, it could be either of them or it could be both of them for all she knows. Like, I just shoot both of them in the legs away for the cops to figure it out. Like, Randy's a horror nerd. I think he'd respect the logic.
Sydney pulled herself together long enough to grab Dewey's sidearm, keeping it firmly pointed in their direction, and keeping Stu sedated long enough for her to get back into the house for a brief moment of relief. In the heat of the moment, Sydney couldn't be sure which of the two to believe, but if she had been able to get a second to think, she might have remembered that only a few minutes earlier, she had watched as Ghostface Stu had been lurking behind Randy, knife out and ready to strike. But the adrenaline, the confusion and the shock had obviously wiped this from her mind momentarily.
Shit, I even forgot about that and we just spoke about it.
So you get how Sydney probably wouldn't remember either, considering everything that's happening and the fact that directly after seeing the Randy Ghostface Stu footage, she witnessed Kenny's murder.
Yeah, super
bastard.
traumatic stuff. Like, there's no way she's thinking straight.
The real traumatic stuff is still to come. This is where the real fun part happens. Well, at least for us, it definitely was not fun for all involved. As Sydney stood there, her mind racing, trying to put the pieces together, the supposedly stabbed Billy stumbled down the stairs into her waiting arms. Billy then convinced her to give him the gun and let Randy into the house, confirming Stu to be the killer along with himself.
Doesn't sound too good for Randy.
No, as soon as Billy had the gun, he shot Randy, revealing himself to Sydney as the killer. Luckily, he had only got Randy in the shoulder, and although his part of this story ends here, he lives on to fight another day, and will feature some more in episode 2.
Awesome. I like Randy.
If you like Randy, why would you be happy that he features in another massacre? Surely you'd prefer that he settled down, had a family, and lived happily ever after, right?
Actually, yeah, that's what I want. Is that what happens to him in the end? Okay. Did he live happily ever after?
With Randy down and Stu creeping up behind her, Sydney's situation looked truly dire, and as if things weren't bad enough for the unwilling final girl, she now had to listen to these two psychos as they revealed their whole master plan like two dopey Bond villains. She listened in shock as Billy revealed that not only were they responsible for the current string of murders, but it had been them that had killed her mother, only a year earlier.
How could you trust a human being ever again? Like, your mother and all your friends are dead and your boyfriend is responsible. What a mindfuck.
Yeah, the man she literally just gave her virginity to turns into a monster almost instantly after the deed is done.
Probably not the best first experience. I definitely don't envy her next boyfriend.
Funny you say that, but before you ask, next episode. Neil, who had been tied up and gagged on the residence that whole night, was then brought out for the final scene. It was here that Billy and Stu made their fatal mistake. You see, the two knew they couldn't be the only unharmed survivors at the party. It would draw way too much suspicion. So they worked out the safest places to stab and took it in turns maiming each other for the alibi. The idiots did all this before killing Sydney and Neil. I mean, talk about giving your opponent the upper hand.
This is insane. It can't be real.
Anyway, as this all went on, Gail, still alive but fairly beat up, managed to make her way back to the house, hearing the mad ravings of Billy and Stu as she entered. She noticed the gun sitting out on the counter right by the kitchen door and took her chance. Unfortunately for her, in all the excitement of getting one up on the killers, she forgot to check the safety, allowing Billy to incapacitate her and regain control of the gun. But Gail's efforts were not a total waste. The distraction she caused allowed Sydney and Neil a chance to hide, and from that hiding place, Sydney was able to contact the sheriff department, giving them her location and the true identity of the Ghostface killers.
Ha! Busted.
With all lost, Billy flew into a rage, tearing through the house, searching for Sydney. If he was going down, then he was going to take her with him. While Billy searched, Stu, weak with blood loss from the alibi stabbings, sunk into denial and began sobbing like a child.
Oh, now I kind of feel bad for the killer again. Can I give him a hug?
If you want to be covered in blood, and there's always the chance that he'll decide to get one more notch in his belt and kill you while you're close to him.
Yeah, you know what? Fuck him then.
Through process of elimination, Billy narrowed in on the closet under the stairs, exactly the place Sydney had been hiding in. Inside, Sydney had found one of the Ghostface masks, and in a vengeful twist of fate, exploded from the closet wearing it, stabbing Billy twice in the chest with the top of an umbrella. Then, without a second to spare, Sydney had Stu to deal with. They wrestled around for a minute or two before Sydney could get the better of him. There, she found herself right by the living room TV. With Stu laid out on the floor in front of her, she finally incapacitated Stu through electrocution by dropping the TV directly on his head.
The end.
Not the end. Billy wasn't done yet, and with his last ounce of energy, he wrestled Sydney to the ground, raising his knife over his head, and bang!
What happened?
Gale turned off the safety, landing a shot directly into Billy's chest before he could bring the knife down on Sydney. And if that wasn't enough to seal the deal, Sidney Prescott put a bullet square between the eyes of Billy Loomis, officially putting an end to the run of the OG killers, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher.
Wow. What a story. Clever pan, nearly perfect, but they would never have gotten away with it.
What makes you say that?
Gail's camera. Even if they had killed Sydney and Neil and convinced the cops they were the victims, the cops would have eventually come across the camera and they would have been caught.
Oh, true. But they would have probably had time to set the scene and get rid of the camera before anyone got there.
If they had known the camera was there at all. It was a spy cam. No one but Gail, Kenny and Sydney knew it was there, and I think that's evident from the fact that they stabbed each other before Sydney and Neil. Like, they were confident that the scene was already set. They surely knew that by the time they took care of all the Prescotts, all they'd have the energy to do is hit the ground.
Shit, I think you're right. Regardless of how the ending went, Billy and Stu would have been caught and would either be on death row now or dead by lethal injection. Either way, the story of the OG killers is over. But Ghostface lives on. Thank you to everyone for listening to the first episode. It's been fun. And if you enjoyed the show, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review.
And tell all your friends about us.
And if you're hungry for more Ghostface, episode 2 and 3 are up and ready to stream or download. And if you like all that, you can check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/IAApod for loads of bonus content and extra episodes. And, follow us on everything. Next week, we'll be back with Amy telling us a slasher tale from Victorian London.
It's good and gory too.
Awesome. And there will be a brand new episode dropping every week from here on. So watch your podcast provider for that. Or, follow us to get new show alerts. Also, if you want to contact us, we're available by email at itsalivealivepod@gmail.com. Until next week, I'm Dr. H.R. Smokenstein, THC.
And I'm Amy Rose, reminding you it's better to be a virgin than it is to be dead.
It's alive! It's alive!
The Really Really Fake True Crime Horror Podcast. All the guts and gore with none of the guilt. See you next week.